gestures. Now, in advance, I went on Facebook and downloaded a few photographs. Let me go ahead and run this application. And we have this application here. And if we swipe to the right, there's his graduation. And one more in his plumber's outfit from this weekend. So we can keep flipping through this, and each time I swipe from right to left, even though you can just barely see my mouse, it's like I'm sliding my finger from left to right. And I kept it simple. I didn't do it quite so that he's sliding off the screen. As soon as I start sliding, it just jumps off to the side, just to keep it simple. But also, if I click and hold on like his nose, it's going to nag at me because I'm using a long press gesture recognizer. So how do we go about implementing this and implementing that kind of functionality? Well, let's go into this. So in my project here, I've got some familiar files and some new ones. Under supporting files, I have 3 photos of Rob. So these are just JPEGs that I dragged and dropped after renaming them, after downloading them from Facebook. I encourage you to friend Rob on Facebook. If you then drag them into the project, I can now access them programmatically. And so now I can do something like this. In main.m is some usual code. In appdelegate.h is some usual code. In appdelegate.m is some usual code. So nothing new here. We're building on the same principles as before. So the magic must be somewhere in my nib and my view controller files. So my view controller.nib file also looks very simple. I dragged and dropped a class called UI image view, which is like a video player, but for images. It's just a placeholder for a single ping or GIF or JPEG or the like. And I configured it to just fill the whole screen. So I need to somehow programmatically have access to that. So a good place to start, again, when downloading code that someone else wrote or that you download online as part of a bigger project, is just control-click on it. And it looks like there is a image view property somewhere that's pointing to file's owner. So there's some kind of linkage happening here, some kind of outlet to the file's owner. So let's look at my .h file. And if I go into my .h file, nothing there. That's interesting. ViewController.m. So I've tried to take things one step further here. Thus far, we've been putting properties and method declarations in our .h files, which is a common convention, but it's not strictly necessary because if all of my methods are implemented in this same file, and if no one else is going to be importing my .h file, and they probably shouldn't be importing my view controller. You would typically import utility classes or files with constants or files for models and the like. There's really no reason for me to advertise to the world, in principle, in my .h file, all of this internal functionality. So I can certainly just declare these properties as private by putting them in this file. And I say private typically because, again, you can still send messages to objects. They may very well respond. But just in the interest of not advertising features, much like Apple does not advertise certain APIs, they keep them private, though people figure it out, I've decided to declare all of my properties here in this file, my .m. So I seem to have a few properties. One is a Boolean called alert in progress. And I ended up using that, if I fast forward to the end of the story, because I needed to remember if and when I had touched Rob's face for too long and therefore triggered the alert view, because I ran into a bug through trial and error that if I kept holding, I might get multiple alert views, and I didn't want to do that. So I wanted a simple locking mechanism to make sure I only open one alert view ever. So next I have an image view pointer to a UI image view, and that's my IB outlet. So that's the wiring between that IB image view, that UI image view and my code. Then I have an index, not sure what that is, and then I have some ROBs in the form of a pointer to an NS array. So let's take a guess. What is going to go in that NS array probably? Yeah. The images. So specifically maybe the names of the images, though we'll see in just a moment. And then the int called index, where I am. So I realized, again, by thinking through the design of this, if I want to implement this sort of carousel of ROBs and I want it to wrap around so that the third image goes back to the first image, I decided just to use an index that's going to be 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and I can use some modular arithmetic to wrap around like you might have done in other languages. So that's where this is going. Meanwhile, I've got some private methods, private only in the sense that they're not advertised in my .h, called alert view did dismiss with button index. We've seen that before. When is that method called? Think back to last week. When the user clicks the cancellation button, however labeled, that big default button, I have another method called handle long press and then handle swipe. And those are implemented to receive something called a recognizer. So a pointer to some kind of object that has recognized what the user has done so I can glean some information about it. So now if I scroll down, what am I going to do when, let's do the handle long press because it's a little simpler. So when I click and hold on Rob's nose, or frankly anywhere on the image, it doesn't matter based on how I've implemented this, what is going to happen? Well, iOS is going to recognize that you're holding Rob's face down for quite some time, and therefore some code's going to get executed, specifically this method, handle long press. I'm going to be passed a pointer to the recognizer in case that's useful. And what I decided to do with that information here is what you saw. I'm going to first check, wait a minute, is there already alert in progress? This is the bool that I referred to earlier, just to make sure we don't get stuck in an infinite loop by holding his face for 4 seconds instead of just 2. Then I set it to yes so that I remember. And this is single-threaded code at this point, so it's not a problem if I'm still holding down. Then I'm going to go ahead and allocate a UI alert view. And we saw this code last time, even though the words are now different. It's going to say, hey, stop that. I have a delegate of self, so not nil, and a cancel button of fine. So this delegate of self is used for what purpose? To tell the view controller that it is done, that the user has dismissed it specifically. So not the view controller. And that is what invokes this method, recall, which we said a moment ago, is the method that's called when you click that close button on a UI alert view. So all of that stuff is pretty much identical to what we saw last week. So that's the method that's called when I do a long press. But how did I teach the program to even listen for those long presses on the image in question? Well, if I scroll down, we look to a couple of places here. One is init with nib name. So this, again, is going to be that method that's automatically called when you are using nibs in your program. This is the opposite of using storyboards, for instance, but there's a similar mechanism for those. So init with nib name is copy and pasted essentially from before, but I've added a bit of code in the middle. I've first said alert in progress, no, because I want to know by default there is no long press, and that makes sense. When the program starts, no one's touching it by default. And then I prepare the ROBs, so to speak, and this is one way of initializing the array. I alloc an NS array, init with objects, and if I am not loading it from a file, for instance, just from a comma-separated list, the syntax is string, comma, string, comma, string, comma, nil, all in square brackets. So that, much like C, is how you can declare an array statically. The nil is important. You have to terminate this C-style array for that reason. And then self.index gets 0. What does this mean? What's the implication? Yeah, start with the first ROB at index location 0. So next, viewDidLoad, recall, is the method that's called once your view, your user interface, has been loaded. And this is your point at which to start configuring some last-minute details after everything's been opened up from the nib file, for instance. So this is new code, but hopefully pretty readable. So notice I first call the parent class's version of this. Whoops. The parent class. So I call super viewDidLoad. Then I load the image. So self.imageView.image. Self.imageView is what? It's a property of type UI image view. If I read the documentation for UI image view, turns out that a UI image view has a property called image, whose value is a pointer to a UI image object, apparently. We've not seen this before, but you can now read it from the code itself. So this class here is called UI image. Turns out it has a convenience method called image_named, whereby if I get the ith rob at the current index, so give me robs bracket 0, but do it dynamically in code here, that is going to give me an image object, a UI image with rob, and I'm going to plop it into the carousel, essentially, the UI image view that allows me to show the image to someone. So now I'm going to listen for presses on Rob's image. So the code's a little ugly, but what I'm doing is declaring a pointer called longPressGesture of type UI longPressGesture recognizer. I am assigning it the return value of calling UI longPressGesture recognizer alloc. So just give me one of these recognizers. I'm initializing it with a target, self. We'll come back to that in a second. Action called handle longPress. So in layman's terms, this is listening for long press, but in slightly more technical terms, what are we telling the UI longPressGesture recognizer object exactly with init with target and action here?
Well, first you're saying that the message to be sent when
Good.
And you're also saying you should send that message to self, so the view controller.
Exactly. So this, again, to recap, means when you detect a UI long press, a couple seconds down with your finger, send the message handle long press, which could have been named anything. I came up with that method. But pass it to specifically myself, the same view controller. And that's why the method earlier in the file is indeed invoked when we hold down the one's finger and call handle long press. So the other recognizers, let's see first, before we see them in action one last time, listen for right swipe. So how do I do this? Same idea. I allocated UI swipe gesture recognizer. I initialize it with target self, and this time I tell it call handle swipe when the user swipes from a certain direction. But what direction is that? In this case, I have to do one additional step. I have to specify the direction, and according to the documentation, swipe gestures have a direction property, and this crazy long constant is what specifies when I go from right to left, essentially, this is what should actually happen. What should happen? Well, here is how we add to an image view, just like we did a few lines ago for the long press. This is how we add a recognizer to an existing view object that is on the screen. You create this recognizer, and you sort of glue it down onto the view so that that view triggers these various actions. Listen for left swipe. I've done that with a separate line of code at the end there, just by changing the constant to be this, and that's so that we can swipe right to left or left to right to increment or decrement the ROBs. And if we go back up here, let's look at the code. Let me fix this. ROB we swapped in this year. Handle swipe, it works how? So this is the method that's called when we swipe right to left, left to right. This is how we figure out the direction. We ask the recognizer that was passed in via the sender argument what direction were you sent in. I'm using a switch, which is like an if-else, but just done slightly differently syntactically. And I decided to do this. If the user has swiped up-down or down-up, do nothing. Now, technically, these lines of code do nothing useful. I just left it there for explicitness' sake, but it immediately breaks, which means there's no effect whatsoever. Meanwhile, the direction left down here has to do a bit of math, and it took a moment to kind of think about this. But I'm updating the index value to be, when I go from right to left, +1, and then I need to wrap around with some modular arithmetic based on the length of the array. Down here, meanwhile, if I wanted to wrap around to the other direction, I had to effectively subtract by 1, but I wanted to make sure that we didn't go negative, so I also have some addition in there just to make sure that 2 goes to 1, 1 goes to 0, 0 goes to 2, and doesn't accidentally go negative. So just some basic modular arithmetic there. And then lastly, what actually updates Rob and updates him instantly is to change the property called image of the image view IB outlet to the image named whatever Rob is at that particular index. So could have implemented this different ways, could have stored the actual images in an array as opposed to the file names, but we kept it simple in this way so we could actually see the strings explicitly in the code. But this is how we can now start listening for these things. And any of these kinds of interactions, pinching and zooming and rotating, is implemented similarly by implementing one or more of these recognizers and then responding accordingly.
How does it handle if we have competing recognizers, say, happen to a long tab? And actually, it's a tab and it's a long tab. Does it only trigger the long tab?
So in that case, if you're detecting tap versus long tap, if you're holding long enough, it will only be a long tap. That's what defines it as long, holding it slightly too long. If you do it within the window, and I think it's 1 or 2 seconds, that would be a tap. But you won't get both if you're holding down like that. You'll just get the long tap.
So there's no way that from any gesture to callback set fire?
You could potentially induce multiple ones. You can give priority to them effectively by listening to which one fires first. And you can think of this again as layers, as to which layer is going to receive the gesture first if you've added to multiple objects. But for the case you described, they'd be mutually exclusive. Other questions? So out of curiosity, how many people are leaning toward web applications for their third and final choice of projects? Or I gave a bad answer there? Okay. All right, a few. And iOS applications? And undecided? Okay, so not, not bad. So start thinking about that, even though I know you're in the midst of Evil Hangman, but you'll soon get feedback by this Wednesday from the Teaching Fellows on the mobile local project, so you can start thinking about what you could have done better there, how you might do things differently for a third and final project if you go with HTML5 and JavaScript. Also think about the native applications, and again, when the specification goes up, you'll see that step 1 is to float the idea by your TF, and he will confirm or deny the appropriateness, the viability given the limited time, and will help guide you towards something that's doable, so that in a few weeks' time, we'll all have some cake and some exhibitions of projects. Why don't we call it a night here, and I'll stick around for questions. See you at lab.